The courthouse that morning buzzed with restless energy. Outside, reporters clustered at the entrance, cameras ready, their voices carrying down the steps as they speculated about what was supposed to be an unprecedented testimony. Inside, curious onlookers squeezed onto the benches, hopping to witness something extraordinary. Rumors had spread like wildfire. A child was going to testify. Some whispered it was a publicity stunt. Others dismissed it as nothing but a delay tactic. Yet curiosity outweighed skepticism, and so the courtroom filled to capacity, packed than most trials of its kind. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy double doors swung open. The bailiff's voice rang out deep, commanding, practiced from years of repeating the same ritual. All rise for the honorable judge. The room stirred to its feet as the judge, a stern-faced man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp glasses, took his seat. His reputation was one of efficiency and order. He didn't tolerate nonsense, and that alone made the whispers of what was about to happen sound absurd. A 3-year-old in his courtroom. What serious matter could possibly justify such a move? As everyone settled, a ripple of unease passed through the room. The bailiff, usually guiding in officers, witnesses, or defendants, now entered with a leash in his hand. At the other end padded a large German shepherd, its coat glossy under the dim courtroom lights. The dog trotted with steady discipline, head held high, tail still, its very presence commanding attention. Several jurors exchanged baffled looks, one even letting out a nervous chuckle before remembering where they were. The judge cleared his throat. "This is highly unusual. I expect full decorum in my courtroom." His gavel tapped once and the nervous laughter evaporated. The dog was led to the front, placed beside the witness stand as if it belonged there. The sight of it drew murmurs. This was no ordinary support animal. This was a police dog, an officer in its own right. Still, its presence only deepened the mystery. Why bring in a dog for testimony? Surely, no animal could take an oath. Then the doors opened again. All eyes turned as a young woman stepped forward, her hand tightly holding the arm of a tiny girl who looked no older than 3. The child clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, its fur worn and ears drooping from overuse. Her hair, light brown and slightly tangled, framed a pale face with wide, uncertain eyes. The sight of her drew an audible reaction, whispers, scoffs, even laughter. Several in the gallery shook their heads, incredulous. "A toddler, in a case like this," someone muttered too loudly. The judge frowned but said nothing, watching carefully as the mother bent low, whispering encouragement to her daughter before leading her toward the stand. The girl's small shoes clicked faintly on the tile floor, though the sound was nearly drowned out by the hushed wave of disbelief that spread through the room. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, exchanging looks with his co-counsel, both of them appearing irritated, perhaps even insulted by what seemed like theatrics. The defense attorney, on the other hand, smirked, folding his arms as if this turn of events only made his job easier. As the girl was helped onto the witness chair, her tiny legs dangling far above the floor, the murmurs grew bolder. A burst of chuckles escaped from the back row. One juror even shook her head, her lips pressed tightly to suppress a laugh. A 3-year-old was not a witness, they all thought. She was a distraction, a sideshow. The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Enough," he said, his voice booming. "I remind everyone, this is a court of law. Anyone incapable of maintaining respect will be removed immediately." The laughter ceased, though smirks lingered here and there. The judge sighed and turned to the prosecutor. "You requested this witness." "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied, his tone clipped. "Though I admit this is unconventional." "Unconventional," the defense lawyer scoffed loudly. "It's absurd. This is a mockery of the judicial system. With all due respect, Your Honor, how can a toddler provide reliable testimony? She's barely old enough to form complete sentences." The judge fixed him with a hard stare. "That will be for this court to determine. Sit down, counselor." Reluctantly, the defense attorney obeyed, though his smirk never left. Meanwhile, the little girl shifted nervously in her seat, clutching the stuffed rabbit. She hadn't spoken yet, and already she had become the center of controversy. The bailiff leaned down, placing the dog, Max, as many recognized him, close enough that his presence was reassuring. The girl's hand reached out instinctively, brushing against his fur, and the shepherd responded with a slow wag of his tail. That small connection did not go unnoticed. A few jurors sat, curiosity flickering where skepticism once rested. The judge leaned forward, softening his voice in a way few had heard him do. "Young lady, do you know why you're here today?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide, her grip tightening on her rabbit. For a moment, silence stretched so long it felt unbearable. Then, in the softest of voices, she whispered, "To talk to Max." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few laughed again, though nervously this time, uncertain whether they should. "To talk to the dog," the defense lawyer barked incredulously, unable to contain himself. "Your Honor, this is—" The judge silenced him with a glare, but inside, even he questioned the logic. A child addressing a dog was not testimony. It was nonsense. Yet the way the child had said it, quiet, unwavering, as if it made perfect sense, stilled him from dismissing it outright. The girl turned, her gaze landing firmly on the German shepherd. Her voice grew stronger, clearer. "Hi, Max," she said. The room stilled. The dog perked his ears, tilting his head as though recognizing her. His tail thumped once against the floor. And just like that, the laughter stopped. What had seemed like a circus act moments ago now hung suspended in silence. Everyone leaned forward, caught between disbelief and fascination. It was as if they were standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for a step that would determine whether the moment was farce or revelation. The little girl hugged her rabbit close, her eyes never leaving the dog. And in that fragile instant, the entire courtroom realized they might be witnessing something far different from what they had expected. The silence that followed the girl's greeting to Max was heavy, the kind that presses against the chest and stills even the smallest movement. For a moment, no one in the courtroom dared to breathe. Then slowly, the German shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching, and gave a small, deliberate wag of his tail. It was not the frantic excitement of a dog greeting a stranger. It was recognition. The murmurs that erupted in the gallery were quickly hushed by the judge's gavel, though even he could not completely mask his astonishment. The child shifted in her seat, no longer clinging quite as tightly to her rabbit. Her voice, still soft but surprisingly clear, cut through the tension. "You remember me, don't you?" she asked, her words directed not at the judge or the attorneys but at the dog itself. Max tilted his head as if answering, his gaze locked onto hers with a focus that seemed almost human. Some laughed again, but this time it was uneasy, a laughter born not of mockery but of disbelief at what they were witnessing. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, smirking with exaggerated confidence. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for several jurors to hear. Yet the jurors were no longer smiling. They were watching the child intently, curiosity piqued despite themselves. Judge cleared his throat, folding his hands atop the bench. "Young lady," he said gently, "can you tell us your name?" The girl blinked up at him, then answered softly, "Sophie." "And do you know why you're here today, Sophie?" he pressed. She hugged the rabbit to her chest once more. "Because Max and me, we saw something, and nobody else did." A ripple of shock spread across the room. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The prosecutor's eyes widened slightly, though he tried to keep his expression composed. The defense attorney stiffened, his smirk faltering. Sophie leaned forward, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness chair. "Max was there. He was brave. He wasn't scared. He helped me not be scared too." Her eyes, bright and earnest, flicked from the judge to the dog, then back again. "And I remember." The effect was instantaneous. What had begun as a sideshow was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The laughter that had once filled the courtroom was gone, replaced by a taut silence, every ear straining to catch her words. She was not babbling or distracted, as many had assumed she would be. She was deliberate, focused in a way far beyond her years. The prosecutor stood, cautious but encouraged. "Sophie," he said kindly, "can you tell us how you know Max?" The little girl nodded eagerly. "Because he found me." Gasps filled the room. Her words hung in the air like a heavy stone thrown into still water, rippling outward, unsettling everyone who heard them. Even the judge sat, his eyes narrowing with a mix of intrigue and concern. He had presided over countless trials, seen witnesses of every kind, but never had a 3-year-old spoken with such quiet certainty, such clarity of memory. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. She's a toddler. She doesn't even know what she's saying. This is nothing but emotional manipulation." "Sit down," the judge interrupted firmly. "This court will hear her out." Sophie blinked at the outburst, then turned her attention back to Max. She reached a tiny hand toward him, fingers wiggling just above the wooden rail of the witness stand. The shepherd rose, stepping closer, and pressed his nose gently against her hand. A collective intake of breath filled the room. For that single moment, there was no denying the bond between them. She smiled, a small, fragile thing that nevertheless carried warmth through the courtroom. "See, he remembers too." And in that instant, the case no longer belonged to lawyers, strategies, or objections. It belonged to a child and her truth, spoken with innocence yet resonating with undeniable power. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. What began as a spectacle, something people came to laugh at, to scoff at, was evolving into something that demanded attention. Sophie sat upright in the witness chair, her small legs still dangling, unable to reach the floor. She smoothed the ear of her stuffed rabbit with trembling fingers, but her eyes never left Max. The German shepherd stood tall beside her, tail low but gently swaying, his gaze fixed on her as though they were communicating in a language no one else could understand. The connection between them was undeniable. The prosecutor, sensing the weight of the moment, stepped closer with cautious respect. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice dropping to a tone usually reserved for speaking with frightened children, "can you tell us about the first time you met Max?" The girl blinked, her tiny brow furrowing as though reaching into the recesses of memory. The courtroom was silent, all ears tuned to her. Then she began. "It was dark," she said quietly, "really dark, and I was all alone." The words fell like stones into the quiet room. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably, parents in the gallery instinctively glancing at their own children. A 3-year-old alone in the dark. There was already tragedy laced into her testimony. Sophie hugged her rabbit, her voice trembling but clear. "I was crying. I called for Mama, but she didn't come. I called again and again. Then," she looked down for a moment, gathering courage. "Then I heard footsteps, big footsteps, and I got really scared." Her little hands gripped the rabbit so tightly it seemed strained. She swallowed hard before continuing. "I thought it was a bad man, but it was. It was Max." The courtroom stilled again. All eyes darted to the dog, who now sat stoically, ears twitching as if he recognized the memory being recounted. Sophie's face brightened slightly, her lips curving into a small smile. "He didn't bark at me. He just sat down, right next to me, so I wouldn't be scared." The image was powerful. This tiny girl huddled in the dark, comforted by the silent presence of a dog trained to find and protect. "He stayed until people came," Sophie continued, her voice stronger now. "He didn't leave me. He made me feel safe." A lump formed in more than one throat in that courtroom. Hardened officers blinked away tears, reporters lowered their pens for a moment, and even Judge, usually stern face, softened as he leaned forward. The prosecutor nodded slowly, his own throat tight. "And you remember that night clearly, Sophie?" She nodded firmly. "Yes, because he made it less scary. I thought I was going to be gone forever, but Max found me." She reached out again, brushing the dog's fur. The shepherd leaned into her touch, and the bond between them pulsed like an unspoken truth that no one could deny. The defense attorney shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and rose. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a child's imagination. Dogs don't think like people. She's remembering details in a way that's convenient for the prosecution. Children this age don't know the difference between dreams and reality. The judge's eyes narrowed. You'll have your turn to cross-examine, counselor. For now, sit down. Reluctantly, the defense attorney sank back into his chair, but his expression betrayed a flicker of unease. He could see the jurors' faces. They weren't dismissing Sophie. They were captivated by her. Sophie, unaware of the legal maneuvers around her, continued speaking softly, as though the entire courtroom had vanished and only she and Max remained. He looked at me with his big brown eyes, she said, and I knew he wanted me to be okay. He didn't talk like people, but he didn't need to. I understood him. He was telling me I wasn't alone anymore. Her words, simple and childlike, carried a depth that silenced any lingering doubt. There was a purity in her testimony, a raw honesty that no lawyer could fabricate. The prosecutor swallowed hard and asked gently, "Sophie, do you remember what happened after Max found you?" Her eyes darkened and she hesitated. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There was a man. He was there before Max came. I heard him." A chill swept across the room. Even the defense attorney stiffened. "What did you hear?" The prosecutor pressed carefully. Sophie closed her eyes, her small hands trembling as she clutched her rabbit. "I heard him say bad words. He was angry, and he dropped something shiny." She opened her eyes again, wide and haunted. "Then he ran away. That's when Max came. He stayed with me until people found us." The prosecutor glanced at the jury, then back at Sophie. "Sophie, are you sure you saw something shiny? Can you tell us what it looked like?" She nodded slowly, like a knife. Gasps erupted from the courtroom. A wave of murmurs surged through the gallery, reporters scribbling frantically, jurors whispering to each other. The judge's gavel slammed down again, demanding order. The defense attorney shot to his feet, his face flushed. "Objection! This is outrageous. She's 3 years old, for God's sake. This testimony is tainted. She's been influenced." But his voice was drowned out by the echo of Sophie's innocent revelation. The detail about the knife had not been released publicly. Only those directly involved in the investigation knew of it. And yet, here it was, spoken aloud by a child too young to grasp its legal significance. Sophie sat back, exhausted but calm, still stroking Max's fur. The shepherd remained motionless, but his steady presence reinforced everything she said. The laughter that had once filled the courtroom was long gone. In its place was awe. No one dared to dismiss her anymore. She wasn't just a child on the stand. She was a witness, one whose voice carried the weight of truth. And in that moment, everyone understood. Sophie and Max had seen something no one else had, and the trial would never be the same again. The courtroom, once filled with muffled laughter at the idea of a toddler testifying, now sat in reverent silence. Sophie's words still hung in the air like smoke from a gun, and no one could escape the weight of them. A 3-year-old had just revealed a detail no one outside the case should have known: the glint of a knife. The defense attorney, Mr. Harrison, knew the tide was shifting against him. He had counted on Sophie being dismissed as an unreliable child. He had banked on the jury rolling their eyes and the judge brushing off her words. But instead, her testimony had pierced through skepticism like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Still, Harrison wasn't ready to give up. His reputation as a ruthless cross-examiner depended on his ability to dismantle even the most compelling witness. He adjusted his tie, rose from his chair, and approached the witness stand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sophie," he said softly, crouching slightly so his towering figure wouldn't seem so imposing, "you're a very brave little girl, but sometimes, when we're very little, our imaginations can play tricks on us. Isn't it true you like fairy tales?" Sophie nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Yes." "And in fairy tales, there are bad men and shiny swords, aren't there?" Harrison pressed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Yes," Sophie admitted. Harrison straightened, casting a triumphant glance at the jury. "So, is it possible, Sophie, that what you remember isn't real? That maybe you dreamed about a bad man with a shiny knife?" The jury shifted uneasily. It was a logical line of questioning. Children her age often blurred the line between dreams and reality. But before Sophie could answer, Max, ever silent, ever watchful, shifted his body closer to her, pressing against the stand. Sophie reached for him instinctively, her little hand burying itself in his fur. Her face hardened with surprising determination. "No," she said firmly, "it wasn't a dream. Dreams don't smell." Harrison froze. "Smell?" Sophie nodded, her tiny voice unwavering. "The man smelled like smoke, like when Daddy burns leaves in the yard." She wrinkled her nose. "And his shoes were loud. Dreams don't make sounds like that. It was real." The courtroom erupted in murmurs again. Reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every word. The jury leaned forward, intrigued. Harrison's smug expression faltered. Judge slammed his gavel. "Order." The prosecutor seized the opportunity, rising swiftly. "Your Honor, may I remind the court that Sophie just provided sensory details consistent with eyewitness testimony, details that cannot be dismissed as imagination. The suspect in this case was, in fact, found with traces of smoke residue on his clothing at the time of arrest." Harrison bristled, his jaw tightening, circumstantial at best. But the jurors' faces told a different story. Skepticism was fading, replaced by curiosity, perhaps even belief. Harrison tried to recover. He crouched again, softening his tone. "Sophie, do you know what it means to tell the truth?" "Yes." "And do you promise you're telling the truth today?" She placed her small hand over her rabbit's chest, mimicking the oath she'd seen grown-ups take earlier. "Cross my heart," she whispered. The simplicity of her words hit harder than any legal argument. Even the most skeptical juror shifted in their seat, visibly moved. Harrison knew he was losing control of the narrative. His questions began to stumble, his confidence cracking. And what about Max? He didn't talk to you, did he? Dogs can't talk." Sophie's lips curled into the faintest smile. "No, he didn't need to, he listened. Better than most people." A ripple of soft laughter, not mocking this time, but affectionate, spread through the courtroom. It wasn't the kind of laughter Harrison wanted. It was the kind that warmed hearts and cemented Sophie's credibility. Judge finally intervened. "Counselor, I think you've made your point. Step back." Harrison retreated reluctantly, his face pale. He knew he'd underestimated the child. He had tried to paint her as naive, but instead, she had painted herself as honest, perceptive, and astonishingly articulate for her age. The prosecutor returned, his tone gentle. "Sophie, just one more question. When Max found you, did you feel safe enough to sleep?" Sophie nodded slowly. "Yes, I curled up next to him. He kept the bad dreams away." The image landed with the force of a hammer on the jury's conscience. A terrified child finding safety beside a loyal dog, the only barrier between her and a world of fear. When Sophie was finally excused, she slid off the witness chair and walked back to her mother, clutching her rabbit in one hand and reaching back for Max with the other. The German shepherd rose, trotting obediently at her side. Together, they left the stand as though leaving behind a piece of truth the court could no longer ignore. The gallery erupted into whispers. Reporters filed urgent notes to editors. Parents held their children closer. And the jury, once skeptical, once dismissive, now wore expressions of empathy and conviction. The shift was undeniable. For weeks leading up to the trial, the defense had enjoyed the upper hand. They had painted the evidence as flimsy, the circumstances as circumstantial. But now, with one child's testimony, the balance had tipped. The truth, once buried under laughter and doubt, had clawed its way into the open. Back at the defense table, Harrison sank into his chair, running a hand over his face. He had faced seasoned detectives, sharp prosecutors, and damning evidence before. but he had never been outmaneuvered by a 3-year-old and a dog. The prosecutor, meanwhile, sat taller than ever. He knew the case was far from over, but momentum was finally on his side. Sophie had not just. She had given the jury something no charts, no forensics, no arguments could provide. She had given them a reason to believe. As the judge called for recess, the courtroom buzzed with a new energy. What had started as a joke, an amusing headline, had transformed into something powerful. No one was laughing anymore. Instead, they were watching, closely, intently, as a little girl and her dog reshaped the course of justice. And though the trial still had many twists to come, one thing was clear. Sophie's voice, once doubted, now echoed louder than anyone else's. When recess ended, the courtroom was charged with a new tension. The jurors filed back into their seats, whispering softly, while the gallery brimmed with speculation. Sophie's testimony had left an indelible impression, but the prosecution wasn't done. They had one more witness to call, one who couldn't speak at all. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, standing tall, "the state calls Officer Max." The defense attorney immediately shot to his feet. "Objection! A dog cannot testify." Judge raised a hand, silencing the courtroom before it could erupt again. "Counselor, calm yourself. The jury understands no verbal testimony will be given by an animal. The state may proceed to demonstrate the canine's involvement in this case." The bailiff led Max forward once more, the German shepherd padding confidently to the center of the courtroom. His presence radiated strength and loyalty. Unlike Sophie, Max wasn't small or fragile. He was trained, disciplined, and formidable, an officer in uniform, only his badge gleaming from the leather harness strapped across his chest. The prosecutor gestured to the handler, officer, who stepped forward in his navy uniform. He placed a reassuring hand on Max's back. "Ladies and of the jury, you've heard testimony from a 3-year-old child. Now you'll see corroboration from a veteran officer of the force, one who just happens to walk on 4 legs." There were faint smiles, but no laughter, not after what Sophie had done. Officer began. "Max is a certified police canine with 4 years of service. He has been trained in tracking, narcotics detection, and suspect apprehension. On the night in question, Max was deployed to locate a missing child." He crouched and gave a hand signal. Instantly, Max lowered his nose to the ground, mimicking the way he had tracked Sophie weeks before, explained each gesture, each subtle movement of the dog's body that told officers when they were on the right path. He described how Max had led them through dark alleys, over broken fences, and finally to the abandoned shed where Sophie was found. Then came the moment that silenced even the defense, displayed a sealed evidence bag containing a tattered piece of cloth. This was found by Max near the shed. Lab tests confirmed it contains fibers matching the defendant's jacket. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Jurors leaned forward, eyes wide. The defense attorney stood abruptly. "Objection, circumstantial. The dog cannot explain context. For all we know, that cloth was planted." But the prosecutor was ready. He snapped open a binder, pulling out a report. "Your Honor, the fibers were embedded in the shed's wooden doorframe, consistent with a struggle. The defendant's jacket was seized at the time of arrest, with a tear in the exact location that matches these fibers. Max didn't just find a scrap of fabric, he found a direct link." Judge nodded gravely, overruled. The jurors exchanged knowing looks. The chain of evidence was tightening. But wasn't finished. He described how Max had guarded Sophie, refusing to leave her side until medical personnel arrived. "In my career," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly, "I've seen Max apprehend dangerous criminals. I've seen him sniff out drugs hidden beneath floorboards. But I've never seen him so protective, so determined as he was with that little girl." As if on cue, Max shifted closer to Sophie, who sat with her mother in the front row. The child's face lit up as she reached out, and Max wagged his tail once, just once, but the gesture was enough to melt the courtroom. The prosecutor spoke again, his voice steady but powerful. "Sophie told us she felt safe enough to sleep beside Max. That wasn't chance. That was the bond between protector and victim, between truth and doubt. And that bond led us to the evidence that ties this crime to the defendant." For the defense, it was a nightmare. Harrison scrambled for objections, but every attempt fell flat. He couldn't cross-examine a dog. He couldn't twist the loyalty of an animal into deceit. Every movement Max made only reinforced Sophie's credibility. Finally, Judge addressed the jury. "You are not to ascribe human testimony to this animal, but you may consider the corroborating evidence presented by the handler." And though the words were measured, the impact was enormous. As Max was led back to the side, he glanced once over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the courtroom with quiet awareness. In that look, it was as if he knew the weight he carried, not just in his teeth or paws, but in the silent testimony of his actions. The jurors were no longer dealing with abstract evidence, cold reports, or legal jargon. They had seen a child's words echoed by the steadfast loyalty of a police dog. They had felt the story breathe life before their very eyes. By the time the court adjourned for the day, it was clear. Sophie's fragile voice and Max's silent proof were two halves of the same truth. Together, they had shifted the trial from uncertainty to inevitability. And for the first time since the case began, the defendant sat rigid, beads of sweat forming at his temple, as if he too understood the tide had turned and there was no going back. The sixth day of the trial dawned with heavy skis, the kind that pressed down on the city like a warning. Inside the courthouse, the air was equally weighted. Everyone knew the end was drawing near. Sophie had spoken. Max had demonstrated. The evidence had been presented and picked apart, but the verdict now depended on one final clash: the closing arguments. Judge entered the courtroom with his usual unshakable composure, but even he carried a subtle gravity that day. He knew the jury's decision would not just determine the fate of the defendant, but also test the strength of a testimony no one had expected to matter. The prosecutor, Mr. Daniels, rose first. His suit looked sharper than usual, his papers meticulously stacked, but it was his voice that commanded the room. Calm, steady, with an undercurrent of conviction. "Ladies and of the jury," he began, his eyes sweeping across the box. "This case began with laughter. A courtroom full of people thought the idea of a 3-year-old witness was absurd. Some believed it was theatrics. Some even whispered it was a desperate move. But you've now seen, with your own eyes, that truth comes in unexpected forms." He gestured gently toward Sophie, who sat quietly beside her mother, her stuffed rabbit nestled in her arms. "This child did not come here to entertain you. She did not come here for sympathy. She came because she is the only eyewitness to a crime committed in darkness and silence." Her voice, fragile as it may seem, carried details no one else could have known. Details that matched forensic evidence. Details that revealed the glint of a knife, the smell of smoke, the sound of heavy shoes. Dreams don't smell. Imagination doesn't bleed into reality so precisely. The jury leaned forward, their faces intent. Daniels had their attention. He paced slowly, each word measured. And when doubt still lingered, when you wondered if a toddler's memory could be trusted, another witness stepped forward. A silent one, Officer Max. He didn't take an oath, but his actions to the truth. He led trained officers directly to the shed where Sophie was hidden. He found the torn fabric that tied the defendant to that shed, and he guarded her with a loyalty that cannot be faked. A dog does not play politics. A dog does not fabricate. A dog simply follows the truth. He stopped and let the silence stretch for a moment, then spoke softer, almost reverently. And together, Sophie and Max gave us a story no criminal could write over. A story of survival, of courage, and of undeniable evidence. Daniel's voice sharpened. He turned suddenly toward the defense table. "The defendant would have you believe this is all a mistake, that fibers match by coincidence, that Sophie dreamed her terror, that Max just happened to track the wrong path. But when you line the pieces together, the picture is clear. This was no coincidence. This was a crime, and Sophie is alive today because of that dog and the officers who followed him. He faced the jury once more. Justice is not always wrapped in grand speeches or complicated forensics. Sometimes it's found in the small, steady voice of a child and in the unwavering loyalty of a dog. And today, justice demands you convict. With that, Daniels returned to his seat. The courtroom hummed with tension. Then came the defense. Mr. Harrison adjusted his jacket, trying to mask the fatigue carved into his face. He walked slowly to the center of the room, his smile faint but still present. His voice carried less certainty than before, but it was sharp, calculated. "Ladies and," he began, "the prosecution wants you to believe in fairy tales. A brave little girl and her loyal dog, what a story. Hollywood couldn't script it better, but we are not here to indulge in stories. We are here to examine evidence. Cold, hard evidence." He jabbed a finger at the prosecution's table. "Fibers, circumstantial, dogs, trained, yes, but not infallible. We've all heard of cases where dogs made mistakes, where trails went cold or evidence was misread. Are you willing to put a man's future in the paws of a dog and the imagination of a toddler?" The jurors shifted, uncomfortable. Harrison pressed on. "Ask yourselves this: can you trust the recollection of a 3-year-old? Science tells us children are suggestible. Their memories are fragile, easily influenced by adults, by fear, by dreams. Sophie may believe she saw a knife, but belief is not proof. She may think she smelled smoke, but memory is a trickster. Are you willing to convict a man based on what a toddler thinks she remembers?" His tone grew more forceful, his arms spreading wide. "And Max? Yes, he found fabric, but dogs follow scents, not suspects. They can be misled. The fabric could have been dropped days earlier, unrelated to any crime. To leap from a scrap of cloth to the certainty of guilt is reckless and dangerous." He turned, his voice now aimed directly at the jury box, low and urgent. "If you convict based on this, you set a precedent. That children too young to understand the weight of their words can decide a man's fate. That animals, noble though they are, can serve as unchallenged witnesses. And that, ladies and, is not justice. That is spectacle." The words cut sharp, and for a moment the room seemed split. But then Harrison faltered. He glanced at Sophie. The child wasn't frowning, wasn't angry. She was simply watching him with wide, innocent eyes, her rabbit clutched close. Max sat at her feet, steady and calm. That quiet picture, unmoved by theatrics, spoke louder than Harrison's arguments. He cleared his throat, turned back to the jury, and gave his final plea. "You must find reasonable doubt, and doubt, I assure you, is everywhere in this case. Thank you." Harrison returned to his chair, his face pale, sweat glistening at his temples. Judge addressed the jury with solemn gravity. "You have heard both sides. You are reminded that sympathy is not a substitute for evidence, nor is skepticism a substitute for truth. The law requires you to weigh everything you've seen and heard, and to deliberate with fairness." As the jury was dismissed to their chambers, the courtroom exhaled collectively. Reporters rushed to file their accounts. Spectators debated in hushed tones. But at the center sat Sophie, her head resting on her mother's arm, her rabbit nestled under her chin. Max lay curled beside her chair, his eyes half closed but alert. They were not strategists. They were not lawyers. Yet, in their innocence and loyalty, they had delivered something more powerful than rhetoric, a sense of truth that lingered in every corner of the courtroom. The jury's decision was hours away, maybe longer. But one thing was undeniable: the case had transcended facts and figures. It had become a moral test, a reckoning with the weight of laughter, doubt, and belief. And as the storm clouds outside finally broke, rain streaking the courthouse windows, everyone inside knew the trial's climax was near. The jury room was smaller than most people imagined. No grand mahogany table or leather chairs, just a square space with neutral paint and a heavy wooden door that locked once the 12 jurors entered. The hum of the courthouse outside faded, replaced with the rustle of papers, the scrape of chairs, and the heavy silence of responsibility. 12 ordinary people plucked from their lives now carried the weight of Sophie's voice, Max's instincts, and a man's future. Foreman James, a retired school principal, cleared his throat. "All right, folks, judge was clear. We must decide based on evidence, not sympathy. Let's start with a show of hands. Guilty, not guilty." 7 hands went up for guilty. 4 hesitated. 1 stayed firmly down. "Not guilty," said Juror 8, a stern-looking woman named. Her voice was clipped, almost defiant. "I don't convict people based on fairy tales and dogs." Across from her, Juror 3, a young mechanic named, shook his head. "Fairy tale? You saw the kid. You heard her details. How would a 3-year-old know about the shed? The torn cloth matched the defendant's jacket." "It's coincidence," snapped. "Children are suggestible, and dogs, they can be wrong. What if Max made a mistake? Are you willing to ruin a man's life based on that?" The room bristled. Tension hung like a wire stretched to snapping. Juror 11, a nurse named, spoke softly. "But Sophie wasn't coached. Did you see her face when she described the knife? That wasn't imagination, that was memory. And Max, dogs don't lie, he led them straight there." The debate ignited. "Memory is tricky," countered. "I read about studies. Kids can think cartoons are real. That prosecutor wrapped you all in a bedtime story and you fell for it." "But what about the fiber evidence?" pushed. "The jacket, the shed, it's not just the kid, it's not just the dog, it's both together." The foreman raised his hand, trying to calm them. "Let's not shout. Let's take this piece by piece. Start with Sophie. Do we believe her?" The jurors went silent, each replaying Sophie's testimony in their minds. She hadn't been dramatic, she hadn't cried for effect. She spoke with the calm of a child repeating what she'd seen, as if explaining the rules of a game. Dark room, smell like smoke, man had shiny thing, Max bite his sleeve. It wasn't the kind of story an adult would invent for her. It was raw, disjointed, simple. Juror 5, a middle-aged librarian, finally said, "I work with kids sometimes, story hours. They exaggerate, sure, but there's a difference between fantasy and trauma. That little girl wasn't pretending." Rolled her eyes. "You're all blinded by emotion." "Emotion," shot back, "or evidence that you don't want to see." The argument circled again, looping through fibers, scent trails, the credibility of toddlers and the fallibility of dogs. Hours bled away. Lunch trays came and went, untouched by most. By late afternoon, exhaustion carved deep lines into their faces, but the deadlock held. 7 guilty, 4 undecided, 1 firm not guilty. The foreman rubbed his temples. "We're not leaving here until we come to a decision. Let's try something. Imagine Sophie was your child. Would you dismiss her words so quickly?" That question hung heavy in the stale air. One of the undecided jurors, a young mother named Karen, bit her lip. She had been wavering all day, torn between skepticism and instinct. Now she pictured her own daughter, small and trusting, trying to explain something frightening. Would she doubt her, or would she listen? "I think she was telling the truth," Karen whispered. "I vote guilty." The numbers shifted. 8 guilty, 3 undecided, 1 not guilty. Slammed her palm on the table. "You can't decide a case on feelings." "Then what about Max?" demanded. "The dog led them there, straight there. No one told him where to go. How do you explain that?" Faltered, lips tightening. "Coincidence." "Too many coincidences," murmured. The room grew quiet again. A clock ticked loudly on the wall, counting the slow minutes. By evening they were worn thin. The judge sent word. No decision tonight, they'd be sequestered and resume in the morning. But the night only deepened the wait. Alone in hotel rooms, jurors replayed Sophie's voice in their heads. They saw Max standing guard. They heard the defense lawyer's warnings about precedent. It was not just a legal puzzle anymore. It was a moral one. When dawn broke, they returned to the chamber weary but clearer. The foreman asked again, "Guilty." 9 hands rose, then 10. Remained firmly down, her jaw set like stone. "Not guilty. I will not be swayed." The room stilled. Could one person hold out forever? Juror 6, an older man named, leaned forward. His voice was low, steady. "You say you want evidence. Think about this. Sophie didn't know what fibers were. She didn't know legal terms. Yet her words matched what investigators found. If she were imagining, how do you explain that?" Silence. Pressed gently. "And Max, he isn't human. He didn't testify with words, but his actions led to proof, not feelings, proof. Isn't that what you asked for?" Looked away, her fingers tightening on her chair. She stayed silent for a long time, wrestling with herself. At last she whispered, "I don't trust children's memories, but I can't explain the dog. I can't explain the fibers." Her hand rose, trembling. "Guilty." A collective breath filled the room. 12 hands were up. The foreman nodded gravely. "We have a verdict." When they filed back into the courtroom that afternoon, the air was electric. Reporters clutched pens. Families held hands. Sophie sat in her mother's lap, Max curled faithfully at her feet. The jurors avoided her gaze, but every one of them carried her voice in their heads. The foreman handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge. The judge scanned it, his face unreadable. Then he turned to the court. "Will the defendant please rise?" The room held its breath. The storm of arguments, doubts, and debates was about to break. And as Judge prepared to read the verdict, Sophie hugged her rabbit. Max lifted his head, ears pricking, as though he already knew what was coming. The courtroom was suffocatingly still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath as Judge unfolded the verdict slip and adjusted his glasses. The defendant stood stiff, his jaw clenched, eyes darting from the jurors to the floor as though trying to find escape. Sophie clutched her stuffed rabbit with both hands, her mother's arms wrapped protectively around her. Max, ever steady, sat at her feet, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the judge as though he understood every word. Judge's voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of finality. "On the charge of aggravated assault, how does the jury find?" The foreman rose, "Guilty." A wave of reaction rippled across the room, gasps, muffled sobs, reporters scribbling madly. Lifted his hand for silence before continuing. "On the charge of unlawful confinement, how does the jury find?" "Guilty." The defendant's face crumpled, the last threads of his arrogance unraveling. He sank heavily into his chair, eyes hollow. His lawyer, Mr. Harrison, closed his briefcase with a snap, his career-defining strategy crushed by the testimony of a child and the instincts of a dog. "And on the charge of attempted murder," said, his tone cutting through the thick air, "how does the jury find?" The foreman's voice was steady, "Guilty." The gallery erupted. Some cheered, others wept. Parents in the audience pulled their children closer. The sound was overwhelming, a storm of relief and disbelief, as if the entire room had been holding its breath for weeks and was now exhaling at once. Sophie didn't quite understand the legal jargon, but she understood enough. She turned to her mother. "The bad man can't hurt anyone now." Her mother's eyes brimmed with tears. She kissed Sophie's forehead. "No, sweetheart, he can't." Max let out a quiet, pressing his head against Sophie's knee, as if affirming it. Judge banged his gavel. "Order, order in the court." Slowly the chaos quieted, though the air still buzzed with raw emotion. "The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Court is adjourned." The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffing the man who had once terrorized a little girl. His eyes, filled with venom, flicked briefly toward Sophie before being dragged away. Max growled low in his throat, not loud enough to disrupt the order, but enough to remind everyone in the room where true loyalty and protection lay. Reporters surged toward the family as they left the courtroom, microphones flashing, questions shouted. Mrs. Turner, how did your daughter know those details? Was she coached? Will Sophie testify again? Does Max have official recognition? Sophie's mother shielded her from the barrage. No questions, please. My daughter is just a child. But Sophie, clutching Max's fur with one hand, paused. Her tiny voice rose above the noise. Max was the hero. He found me. He kept me safe. I just told what I saw. It was such a simple declaration, yet it cut through the frenzy like a blade. Reporters froze, pens hovering, cameras zooming. A 3-year-old had just stripped away the noise, leaving only truth. From that day forward, headlines blared across the nation. Toddler's testimony, police dog's loyalty secure conviction. News programs replayed footage of Sophie on the stand, her small voice recounting what adults had missed. Editorials praised Judge for allowing her testimony, sparking debates in legal circles about the role of child witnesses and the extraordinary reliability of canine partnerships. In police precincts across the country, Max's name became legendary. Officers pinned photos of the German Shepherd in there, using his story to remind rookies why they trusted their K9 partners with their lives. Children in schools drew pictures of Sophie and Max, wide-eyed depictions of bravery and friendship. But for Sophie, life slowly returned to the rhythms of childhood. She went back to coloring books, fairy tales, and playgrounds. The shadows of the trial lingered in whispers, but Max was always there, padding beside her, sleeping at the foot of her bed, ensuring nightmares never fully reached her. Her mother noticed the change. Sophie wasn't just a child anymore. She was something more resilient, her innocence but not shattered. And whenever people asked, Sophie never claimed to be brave. She always answered the same: Max was brave, I was just there. Years later, legal scholars would cite the People versus Archer as a turning point in courtroom history. It wasn't the evidence alone that secured the conviction. It was the trust in a child's perspective, validated by the loyalty of a dog. Judges debated, lawyers argued, but juries never forgot the image of a little girl clutching her rabbit while a German Shepherd sat guard at her feet. In a way, Sophie and Max had reshaped the law, not with sweeping legislation, but with honesty and instinct. They reminded the world that truth could come from the smallest voices and the most loyal hearts. On the courthouse steps that day, as cameras clicked and reporters clamored, Sophie bent down and whispered something only Max could hear. He wagged his tail, nuzzling her face. Her words weren't recorded, but those closest said she whispered, "We did it, Max. We told the truth." And in that moment, though laughter had once filled the courtroom at the idea of a toddler and a dog taking the stand, no one was laughing anymore. Instead, they stood witness to a bond so pure, so unshakable, that it carved itself into history. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar with authority or thunder with evidence. Sometimes it speaks softly, in the voice of a child, in the loyalty of a dog, and the world has no choice but to listen.